Welcome to this Autism Ontario webinar, Self-Regulation for Teens with ASD. My name is Matthew Lay, and as always, I will be your host. Teenagers don't yet possess the executive function of adults, and yet they probably need it more than we do. Now, this makes self-regulation a challenge that is enhanced for those on the spectrum. Today we are joined by, dare I say, an expert in self-regulation, Dr. Stuart Shanker, author, Distinguished Research Professor of Philosophy and Psychology at York University, and the CEO of the Merit Center. Stuart, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, Matt.
Before I get started, as always, I've got some housekeeping items for you. A big part of what I do on the desk is try and get your questions answered. So you can submit your questions at any time using the Ask a Question box at the bottom of the webinar console. We ask you today to let us know who you are when you're asking the question. It's a question for yourself, for a loved one, perhaps a child, or if you're a caregiver, a patient, or a student that you work with. Now, throughout the presentation, we will be referencing some resources that help inform our discussion. You can access those in the Resource Center. If you have any problems with the technology in any way, click on the Help button. All right, with all that out of the way, let's get started, Stuart. Self-regulation. Why are we talking about this?
Well, we've made some huge advances over the last 10 years in our understanding of what self-regulation is and why it's so different from self-control and why teens that are on the spectrum have so much trouble with self-regulation.
Okay. But a basis of where they require self-regulation often is stress.
Yeah.
So let's get a baseline. What is stress?
It's a great question. You know, self-regulation, properly understood, refers to how we manage stress.
Yeah.
And what's not well understood is what exactly a stress is. So for scientists, a stress is anything that requires us to burn energy in order to keep some internal system running smoothly.
Okay. So give us some examples of stressors, if you will, that our audience today might be facing or might be bumping into.
Well, I'll give you a good one since a lot of our audience will have exactly this as an issue. You have to do this as a job, and It's not an easy job. And one of the problems you've got is you've got these bright lights on you. Mm-hmm. Now, bright lights are, in fact, a stressor. They are draining your energy even while you're not aware of it. And for a lot of kids on the spectrum, light is, in fact, a significant stress.
Okay. And I guess the fact that I have done this for a while, that stress should be reduced for me the more times I'm exposed to it?
That's a great question. You know, there's two answers to it. One is that we're not all the same.
Right.
So for some of us, and you may be one of them, we actually love bright light. Maybe you're one of those ones that wakes up. I love bright light, and it makes me feel energized. Yeah. But for others, it has the opposite effect. It makes us feel a little bit anxious even.
Okay, so what are some of the other stressors that we need to be looking out for?
Every single person is different.
Right.
And so you become what we call a stress detective.
Yeah.
So maybe for one kid, it's going to be noise, certain kinds of noise.
Yeah.
Maybe it's smells. Right. Maybe it's crowds. Maybe it's, and so we start to go deeper and deeper. And as you and I will get into, we look at stress in 5 domains.
Okay.
And for a kid on the spectrum, for a teen on the spectrum, it's really important to look at all 5 of these domains.
Right. Okay, so you want to get into what those 5 domains actually look like?
Sure. So we did have do we have a screen of the 5 domains?
I believe so, back one.
Back one. So what's important is that our sort of conventional understanding of stress, when we hear that, we just think in terms of, say, emotional stress.
Right.
And those are stresses. And for kids on the spectrum, they're big stresses when they become teenagers.
Right.
So that can be things like strong emotions, feeling pressed, all those things. But in fact, we now know that stress, given that it's anything that requires us to burn energy, has we look at physical stresses, we look at cognitive stresses, the stresses that you encounter trying to, say, learn mathematics.
Right.
We look at social stresses, and that's a very big stress for teens.
Yeah.
And then finally, we look at something called a prosocial stress, and that's how well you can deal with somebody else's stress.
Right. And so I said off the top, dare I say an expert, but in fact, the Merit Center, which you founded as CEO, this is what you basically this is all you guys do, right? Work
Yeah.
on self-regulation.
Yeah.
An interesting point that came out in our pre-discussion is that it started helping those on the spectrum, but it has expanded beyond it. This is not a specific issue for teens on the spectrum, correct?
Yes. I wrote a piece about, I guess it's about 15 years ago now, where I said that all the work that we were doing with children and teens on the spectrum was
Right.
going to transform all of our work with all kids.
Right.
And the reason is because kids on the spectrum, for the kinds of biological issues that we see in autism,
Yeah.
they have more stress than, say, a typical teen. But it's not different.
Right.
It's just more. They're the extreme. And so the more we learned from our work with them
Right.
about how to manage stress, how to reduce stress, the more we could begin to apply these techniques to essentially every kid in the country.
Right. We have hundreds of people online with us today. This topic was a very popular one. One thing I like to ask people in your position who have just so much experience in a single topic is, when you look at the five items we have on the screen here,
Yeah.
do you find that quite often when parents start talking to you or caregivers start talking to you, that they make mistakes in identifying what are the stressors that are causing the concerns?
All the time.
Yeah.
And, so one of the big issues that we have to address when we work with parents
Right.
is a lot of the stresses that their kids are under are what we call hidden stresses.
Okay.
So a hidden stress is something you don't even suspect is a stress. And then, say, the next day, your kid is having a lot of trouble and it's a bad day, and not realizing that what was actually going on the previous, say, night was an awful lot of these costs on the nervous system, burning up the kid's energy.
Right. And so it manifests itself later.
Exactly right.
And I guess a mistake would be dealing with that manifestation and not getting to the root of what
That's
the issue
just
is.
brilliant.
Yeah.
Seriously, right? So now what we want to do, so let's say our kid wakes up the next morning and it's a bad morning, it's
Right.
a bad day. And so rather than getting angry or trying to control this situation, we want to reframe it. That's a big thing for self-regulation. It's telling us that there were stresses.
Right.
It's telling us that those stresses probably occurred the previous day. Now I'm going to start to figure out what were those stresses. So exactly the point that you made is the one we stress. See the significance of this behavior. It's telling you, I've got to start digging here. I've got to figure out, why did this happen? Why am I so drained today?
Right. But stress itself is here for a reason.
Yeah.
Right?
So we use this graphic for that.
Yeah. The idea of fight or flight or whatever, that keeps us safe, right?
Yeah, so we need stress.
Right.
And so we have this distinction between positive and negative stress. Positive stress, what it does is it wakes you up. It gets you, it gives you this zest to, confront some sort of a challenge.
Right.
And so what are the positive stresses that, say, a teen's has to deal with? Well, school.
Right.
And it's good for you.
Yeah.
The problem is, if you look at that graphic that we've got up there, that if there's too much stress, that positive can become a negative.
Right.
So there are some stresses that we think are purely negative, and there are some stresses that can start off being positive, but if there's too much of it, turn into, I'll give you an example of this. So my favorite way of dealing with stress is I run. I run every day. I should tell you, though, that my children now say I'm not allowed to call it running anymore. So
Is the speed has decreased somewhat?
Yeah, my daughter says I'm going out for my daily shuffle. But now, what I've learned over the years is that if I run at the right pace and the right amount, I feel energized. But if I overdo it, then I suffer in terms of my sleep and my recovery the next day. So I've taken that positive, and by overdoing it, I've turned it into a negative.
Right. Okay. We got our first question, and I expect we're going to get a number of questions like this, talking about a manifestation and maybe not a root cause. But I'm gonna put it to you and see how you would deal with it. I noticed that my son hits himself when he is angry. What should I do?
It is a great question, right? And let's just expand it a little bit. So it could be that he hits himself, or it could be that he starts to shout, or that he starts to perseverate. It can be lots of things. So the very first step of this Self-Reg method that we've developed is you reframe the behavior. And what that means is that what we want to look at is what led up to this.
Right.
So these behaviors happen because the child's stress has been building and building. You know, there's going to be lots of times where he doesn't hit himself, lots of times where he starts to get angry, but then calms down and doesn't go into that.
Yeah.
So what's the difference between them? Well, the difference is that when the stress level gets too high, that shift that we were looking at here occurs.
Right.
The kid spills over into something that we call red brain.
Right.
And that's when you start to get these behaviors. So what we want to do is we want to think really hard now about antecedent things. What were the total number of stresses that my kid was dealing with in all 5 domains? And now we'll start to piece it together, going back, thinking through what are the stresses that I can begin to reduce. Now, the next part of the question is, what do I do in the moment when this happens?
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, with people on the spectrum, which is a big spectrum,
Yep.
I was going to ask, is it important to deal with it right then and there, or do you need to go back to it to figure it out?
So both, right?
Okay.
So the next step is, so now what am I going to do in this moment? Well, the very first thing I'm going to do is reduce as much stress as I possibly can.
Right.
Well, how can I do that? Well, lots of ways. So one of the things that we're going to do is we'll turn off the lights.
Right.
We'll talk in a slow, lower our voice.
Right.
Maybe what we'll do is we'll get down on our child's level.
Right.
What we like to do is we love, if the kid likes tactile, likes massage, then we'll start to massage if we get permission to do it. So maybe stroking their arm, or if they like it, their hair. But one way or another, what we're going to try to do in this moment is not try to use language to get them to stop. We're not going to explain. We're not going to lecture.
Yep.
In this state, they can't process this.
Right.
So really what we're going to try to do is the following. When that happens, we have a little alarm. You were asking me about this before. We have a little alarm deep within our subcortex, deep within, it's called the amygdala. That alarm is ringing. That's why the child is doing whatever they're doing. We have to turn off the alarm.
Right.
How do we turn off the alarm? By reducing the stress
Right.
as much as we possibly can. And the child will quickly begin to associate when he has these episodes
Right.
that he has to himself figure out, what was going on, what was leading up to this. Now, one of the questions we do get asked an awful lot by parents is, at what age can a child start to do this?
Right.
In our studies, we saw them starting to do this by the age of 3.
Wow.
Yes.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
So the first step is to, the immediate stresses, the noise, the lights, whatever it might be. We bring them down, but how do we reframe it? What are strategies to get to the point of it?
So the number one, if we're going to make this as clear as we can, the number one is to distinguish between misbehavior and stress behavior.
That's got to be really hard.
You know what? Once you begin to understand this stuff, it becomes an automatic.
Okay.
So there are signs of stress behavior. So I'll give you an interesting one.
Yeah.
One of the things that we see with a lot of teens is the pitch of their voice changes when it's stress behavior. The pitch goes up, and there's reasons for this, and they're kind of complicated neuroscientific ones. But basically, that's a sign that's telling you this is a stress behavior.
Right.
Their pupils dilate. That's a sign. So sometimes the signs are real easy.
Right.
So if it's perseveration or whatever, that's an easy sign. But sometimes the signs can be really, really subtle. What's hard, I think, for parents is, in my experience, parents with a child on the spectrum pretty much know.
Okay.
It's the other adults in the kid's life that don't know.
Right.
And they see this as misbehavior.
Yeah.
And they are harming your child.
Right.
Because they think, well, this is deliberate, this is intentional, this child has to be punished, and they start to yell, or they're going to have consequences. So if we can get them to understand this distinction, if they can reframe it and see its stress behavior, then all of the adults in that child's life can begin to reduce the stress on a daily basis.
We talked earlier about, the Merit Center is primarily an online delivery model for education on self-regulation. What type of, call it, tools are there that would help parents in a scenario like this better understand what might be considered stress behavior versus bad behavior or whatever it might be?
The lesson that we've learned, we've been doing this for a while now, and the number one lesson that we've learned is to start with yourself.
Okay.
So if you're the parent of a child that's on the spectrum, or if you're a teacher, this is very stressful. Mm-hmm. And, parents are so, they're so anxious to help their child. Teachers are anxious to help the child. And they don't recognize how they themselves are going into red brain.
Right.
So what we do now in all of the work we do on those online courses is we start off with your own self-regulation, recognizing, reframing my own signs of when I am starting to go into red brain.
Okay, so start with ourselves. We got some more questions coming in. I'm going to jump to those right now.
Go ahead.
This is an interesting one. My 5-year-old daughter is struggling with waiting her turn. Teachers and friends are getting frustrated with her. Will her ability to self-regulate change over time?
So there's two aspects to that question, both of them very interesting.
Yeah.
So the first thing is, this is not unusual, right?
Yes.
So all kids have this trouble. Now, there was a very interesting little experiment that was done in the U.S.
Yeah.
People that were waiting in line to get through security at the airport.
Yeah.
And so what they did, this is very stressful for travelers, and so what they did was they put up these large screens, and so they show TV shows, and guess what? People's stress level drops dramatically.
Wow.
Yeah, so there's an interesting lesson for us here. So now, what I want to say to this to my 5-year-old child is, you shouldn't be stressed. You have to wait your turn. Yeah. But instead, I want to start to look at what are the ways that I can reduce the stress of this situation. Is it a fidget toy? Is it? So we start to experiment, and so what we do find is that there are all kinds of ways that we can make this a fun activity and not a stress activity.
Right.
Now, the second part of the question, which is equally interesting, is will my child's ability to self-regulate improve as they grow older? And the answer is only if you work on it.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's not like, they're 1 and they're not talking yet. Eventually they'll talk. This is something that does require work.
Yes, and unfortunately, what parents have to recognize is we are seeing, we didn't go through this, you and I, but we're seeing an explosion in Canada of stress-related problems.
Yes.
And what that's telling us is there are a lot of stresses today. Mm-hmm. And these stresses, so many of them are not obvious stresses. Can I give you one example?
Perfect, yeah.
Okay, so here's an interesting one. We've seen this dramatic shift in what children will drink.
Okay.
Okay, so now kids, so when I was a child, you drank water or you drank milk. That was it. So now we see about 97% of what they're drinking is somehow sweetened.
Okay.
Okay, so it's either pop or sweetened juice, whatever.
Yeah.
The problem is that sugar is a stress.
Okay.
And so we have a
I thought it was more of a reward than it was a stress.
Well, it is. It's a reward because it gives you a burst of energy, plus it suppresses negative feelings.
Yeah.
But the problem is that you have a system deep inside your brain that monitors how much sugar is in it, how much glucose is in your bloodstream.
Yeah.
And if there's too much, it's a poison. If it's too much, it's toxic. So what the brain does is it burns an awful lot of energy to bring those levels safe.
Huh.
It produces insulin and so on. So I can have a kid. So let's go back to your example before, the kid who wakes up early in the morning and it's been a bad day.
Yeah.
But I start to think about it and I say, oh my goodness, he drank a supersized gulpy the previous night. And while he was sleeping, his brain is burning a lot of energy to bring those sugar levels back down to normal.
Yeah.
So in the book, we talk about this a lot. Like, what are the hidden stresses that are draining your child's nervous system? Things that you never suspected were actually draining the nervous system.
And proving that our parents or maybe our grandparents were right, that you shouldn't have sugar before bed.
Well, unfortunately, they were right about a lot of things.
One interesting thing that happens sometimes is there's a general prevailing perception in society going against what people in your spot know. So you just said something to me that there's a lot more stresses, right?
Yeah.
And you know, and I can see that because people are always out there. We hear often in both advertisements and in just general, you need to take a vacation, or you need this, or we need that because of how stressful our life is. But then I often hear about people outside of a given profession like yourself, people who I consider intelligent people, friends, saying, well, it's the same as it was when I was a kid. You know, there aren't that many any more stresses. Are you saying that there are more stresses in our society?
So I've certainly heard this an awful lot.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's very difficult for us to say categorically yes, no.
Right.
But what we do look at is we look at the dramatic rise in, say, mental health problems that we feel are stress-related. So let's take as an example anxiety. So anxiety is now out of control with our teens. And this is an indicator for us that their stresses are too high.
Right.
Now, the second part of this question, which is a really interesting one, is which stress? I mean, you know, they don't have to work. So we start to look at all those aspects of modern life, which are stresses without our realizing it. So I gave you the sugar example. Here's another one. Kids have stopped chewing. I know it sounds strange.
It does sound strange.
But so much of their diet today is food that does not require chewing.
Okay.
And this is deliberate.
Yeah.
But there's a problem, and the problem is that we actually need to chew.
Okay.
Our species was designed to chew, and we get serotonin, which is a nice regulating neurohormone, when we chew.
Wow.
So if I've got a kid now who will only eat non-chewing foods, so hamburgers that have been pre-chewed or chicken nuggets that are, so here's a little thing where we are, it's both a function of things that are stresses without our knowing it, or things that kids aren't doing.
Yeah.
Like running around, like being in nature, like eating an apple, which are natural stress reducers. So one way or another, we do feel there's a difference today. And the next part of the question is that in the meantime, for today, we are dealing with teens on the spectrum that have a lot of stress.
Yeah.
And so our major concern today is I know that my kid is overstressed. I need to know, what do I do about it? And the first step, to go back to your previous question, is recognize the signs.
Right.
Recognize the little tells that tell you he's starting to go, or she's starting to go up this trajectory of hitting a peak of too much stress.
Right.
When they hit the peak, that's when you get the problems. So we want to stop this climb before it happens, before it hits that peak.
Right. And to make things even more complex, I'm going to move on now in our presentation a bit, but there's a difference between stress or a stressful event and a cycle of stress, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so how does the cycle of stress look, and how does it affect their ability to figure out what is causing this?
So when we're working with teens that are on the spectrum, this idea of a stress cycle is absolutely pivotal. And what that means is that you're really dealing with a cluster of stresses all at the same time. So if you go back to our slide with the 5 domains, so you've got a physical stress like you're tired or there's too much noise. Now what happens is these stresses from the different domains start to bounce against each other, like electrons in a bell scope. And they intensify each other. They magnify each other. And when a child gets caught in a stress cycle, what's happening is their threshold for having a stress reaction is lowered.
Okay.
So I'll give you a really simple example. I can have my kid, I can take my kid to a restaurant.
Right.
And when they are well rested and the stress level's low, they actually enjoy this experience. But if my child is caught in a stress cycle, which means they're burning way too much energy and the stresses are bouncing against each other, they can go into that same restaurant and now it overwhelms them.
Right.
The noise, the cutlery, the bustle.
Yeah.
And so when we are trying to help a teen who is caught in a stress cycle, what's essential is that we reduce the stressors in all 5 domains. I just want to clarify this one point. It's so natural for us to focus on one issue.
Right.
So we think this is the stress.
Right.
But if it's
noise in the restaurant is causing this. Yeah. That's it. We need to get out of the restaurant because that's where the issue lies.
Or I've got to put
headphones or whatever.
Whatever. So, but then I stopped. I think, but wait a second. Last week we were here and he loved it.
Yeah.
So what's the difference? Well, the difference is his stress level's way too high. So one of the things we have to learn when we do self-reg is don't jump at the obvious stress. Look at the whole stress cycle. It's the whole cycle that has to be reduced, not just the obvious one. And in the book, we tell this story about this one kid where she was 13, she got stressed out because mom had bought her a gray sweatshirt when she'd asked for a pink one, like all the other girls. And so it seemed so obvious that it was that social stress that was the issue.
Yeah.
But what mom did was she did self-reg. She reduced all of the physical stresses, calmed the child down, and the very next morning, this child who had exploded the night before came downstairs happily wearing the gray sweatshirt. Yeah.
So maybe I'm getting a bit of free advice here, but also wondering if you see this. So we mentioned earlier, my son has some issues with self-regulation at times, and one of the things I constantly hear from him when he has an episode, if you will, or he gets upset or cries in the classroom is, I should have been able to deal with that. I shouldn't cry because of this, Daddy. I didn't yesterday when something similar happened. So not only is this cycle occurring, but it's getting worse when he does have an incident. Is that something that you see?
All the time.
Okay.
And so, we talk about these distinctions. You and I were talking about them before. So when we do self-regulation, we are constantly distinguishing not just between misbehavior and stress behavior, but we distinguish between self-regulation and self-control.
Right.
And someone has been telling your son, and it's not you because I know you well enough now to know it wasn't you, but teachers, coaches, whoever it is, that when this happens to him, he has to exercise more self-control. The kid internalizes, oh, I'm being weak. This makes it worse because now he starts to beat himself up. But in fact, what we see is it had nothing to do with self-control. It was about self-regulation. It was about the stresses had gotten too high, and that's what causes that slide into stress behavior. When we tell this to a parent, when we tell this to a kid, that you have to see this difference between self-control and self-regulation, what happens is, it's like this weight is lifted off their shoulders. And they suddenly see, oh, it wasn't that I was bad. It wasn't that I was weak. It was just that I was overstressed. And now I can start to figure out why was I overstressed and what do I do about it?
Yeah, it goes from behavioral issue at the parent to an issue that I care about that my child does have. From our audience, and keep the questions coming, guys. We will have time to answer as many of them as possible. My 5-year-old daughter is struggling. My daughter is constantly biting her nails and sucks on her hands, causing her skin to become irritated. Is this a stress-related or sensory-seeking behavior? How can I help reduce and/or eliminate it?
Okay, so again, these are great questions that you're getting. Okay, so yes, it is a stress behavior. And so one of the things that's happening is by doing this, we can actually stimulate neurochemicals that reduce the stress overload, that make us feel better. What you said before about sugar. So what we don't want to do is we want to get out of the mindset of how do I eliminate this. And so instead, what we want to do is reframe this behavior. And so we want to see this behavior as a sign. These are one of my signs that my child is really overstressed. So now what I'm going to try to do is exactly what you and I were talking about before. So we're going to start to go through, when is this happening? Why is this happening? 5-year-old, does this happen? Is she in kindergarten? Is it happening at the end of the day? Is it early in the day? She's anxious about going. So we're going to try to figure out these patterns. Now, so that's the first part, reframing this behavior, seeing what it's telling us about my child's stress load. Now, the second part, again, we come back to the point you made. What do I do in the moment now? Exactly the same thing. So what I'm not going to try to do is, these really kind of aversive techniques to make it unpleasant, even more unpleasant for them to do it. So instead, what I'm going to do in the moment is I'm not going to worry about this, what's happening, but instead I'm going to worry about how can I reduce the stress?
Right.
What can I do? Well, if I give her a weighted blanket, if I put her feet in a foot massager, what are the things that I can do to soothe my child? And that becomes our major issue. Not this, I love what you said before, not this behavior, which I am trying to manage, that I'm trying to stop, but instead the underlying conditions in the nervous system that have resulted in this behavior. That's what I'm going to go after, and I'm not going to worry about whatever that.
Because really, I mean, we had, and I forget the gentleman saying, we had another author on the desk not a month ago, and every time we came up with this question, it was a very similar answer. And I'm feeling that this way is that whether it's hitting yourself, whether it's biting nails, whether it's this, it's important to know that it's a stress behavior, but it's all the same answer, really, right?
Yes.
And what you need to do.
Yes.
So let's get into that answer.
Okay.
And the book talks about the Chancre Method.
Yeah.
So what is the Chancre Method? How do you encapsulate Self-Reg?
So what we were trying to do here was crystallize what we'd learned through an awful lot of work, not just our own, but the work of the people that trained me and the people that trained them. So I was trained by Stanley Greenspan. And the very first step of this is reframing.
Okay.
Reframing is really interesting. So let's flip this a little bit.
Right.
How do I reframe my own behavior? Because I said to you that our starting point is to do our own self-reg.
Right.
So suppose that I'm having trouble falling asleep. Suppose I'm having trouble staying asleep. Suppose I'm having trouble resisting some incredibly strong food craving. And I start to tell myself the exact thing that you and I were talking about a second ago. Well, I must be weak.
Yeah.
And instead, what we want to do is, if I've got that really, say, strong craving, I want to reframe it. Because the craving is telling me, these cravings come from the limbic system.
Yeah.
It's telling me my stress is too high.
Right.
And so what we want to do is, instead of fighting the craving, what we try to do is we figure out, why am I so stressed? What can I do to reduce my stress and to restore myself? And guess what happens? The craving, either it disappears, or go eat your bag of potato chips. I don't care.
Whatever it is, yeah.
But what matters here is the reframing. And we do it for ourselves. We do it for our child. Reframing their behavior, seeing it as a stress behavior. The next step is figuring out what the stressors are.
Right.
And this is not something you're going to figure out in a couple of days.
No.
Like this is and by the way, child's stresses are constantly changing.
Yeah.
And so this is an ongoing process. And
it's interesting. Their stresses are constantly changing, but I'm sure that the outcomes are not, right?
No, that's exactly right.
So whatever's displaying stress.
Well, think about a teen, right? So I mean, with a teenager, they have suddenly been exposed to a whole new range of stresses.
Yeah.
Physical, social, and so so when you talk about the outcomes staying the same, what's essential is the self-reg staying the same.
Right.
So then the third step is, how do I reduce these stresses? Which are the ones I can reduce, and how do I do it? The fourth step is a very interesting one. We are seeing a generation that we feel doesn't know what it feels like to be calm. And there's all kinds of ways to keep yourself running at 78 RPM.
Yeah.
So what we have to do is we have to get them to actually feel calm and enjoy feeling calm.
Right.
These are not one and the same thing.
No.
And what we're working on in this fourth step, it's called stress awareness, is it's only when you know what calmness feels like that you can feel when you're starting to become agitated. And that brings us to the fifth step. Okay, so you feel yourself starting to go up, what I was talking about, that incline. What do I do? Here, every single family has to discover their own number 5.
Right.
So for one family, it might be, or for one kid, it might be, I don't know, yoga. For another kid, it might be cooking. It might be gardening. It might be running, whatever it is. But it has to be something that that child or that family finds enjoyable and calming. And there is no one size fits all. This isn't like going into, Eaton's and buying a suit off the rack. This is about custom tailored.
Yeah. And I imagine some trial and error, right?
Trial and error.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely right.
Running works for you. I hate running, but, ping pong works for me.
Okay, I hate ping pong.
Let's go back to some questions from you, our audience, on the topic. My son, 15 years old, talks to himself during the meal and tunes us out. He asks questions but doesn't listen to our answers. What should we do? Is this a stress issue?
Yes.
Okay.
Again, these questions are good. So one of the things that goes on is there's, again, two different things that are involved in that question.
Yeah.
One of the things that happens when a child gets overstressed is they go through this, basically what's a neural shift. Right. So one part of the brain, we call it the blue brain, becomes much less functional.
Right.
And the deep part of the brain, the red brain, the limbic system, becomes more. Now, one of the aspects of this shift that's fascinating is that the child's ability to hear and process language declines.
Okay.
The auditory processing itself is part of this shift. The child is not actually tuning you out. The child doesn't hear, doesn't process. So this is a fascinating aspect. You think about these kids on the spectrum who've gone through primary and been yelled at by a teacher for not paying attention, but in fact they didn't hear it. They didn't process it. Now the second part of that question is, why is he talking to himself? Well, this is self-soothing behavior.
Right.
And it could be that self-talking, or it could be perseverating, whatever. So, yes.
Sorry, perseverating
perseverating is continuing on an action, we'll talk about self-stimming or.
Yeah.
So the point is that the parent here has picked up that this is a sign of stress. And so both the self-talk and the not hearing are signs that, that this is stressful. Now, it's a very interesting question. Why? Right? So this is one that we wrote about this in the book. We had this very interesting case where, and it was also a 15 or 16-year-old boy.
Yeah.
And he found meals very stressful. And so you start to break it down, and there's a lot of things going on. In that case, he found the sound of other people talking, the noise of the cutlery on the plate, and even food itself can be a stress.
Yeah.
They get anxious about, so there's a lot of stresses that are going on. And so it became, for this family, a fun thing. How can we make meals a lot less stressful,
right,
so that he is able to talk with us, that he does enjoy this process. And so the kind of message here is, we don't want this to be just like, this is a negative thing, it's too much stress. It's actually fun. It's fun when you start to understand what's going on here, and now we're going to problem solve together. Both of us understanding that this is happening, and now we'll try to figure out what are the stresses and how can we make this a really enriching experience, because that's what meals should be, right?
They should be, yeah. We have a 12-year-old daughter with ASD, and she has an older, typical 14-year-old sister. The autism has created a very stressful relationship between the two, I assume. How can we help both children to self-regulate, especially right in the moment of red brain? Is the strategy the same when dealing with two people in the same situation?
So I keep on saying this, but again, two very interesting things going on in this question. So this is very stressful for a typical sibling.
Yeah.
And it's important for us to recognize the stress of having a younger sibling or an older sibling or a child.
Right.
This is very stressful. So having seen that tells us that I actually have to do self-reg with both of my children.
Right.
I have to go through the 5 steps with both of them, alone, independent.
Right.
Now, the second part of the question is, what do I do in this moment when they've both gone into red brain?
Exactly.
And that's what you've got to figure out as a parent. Is it separation? Is it not as punishment,
No.
Right. But as reducing the stress, is it you know, having spaces where they can go where each of them feels safe and secure? I mentioned to you when you and I got started today that what we're trying to do in these situations is turn off the alarm.
Right.
Both of them have an alarm that's going and they're pinging off each other.
Yeah.
So how do we turn off an alarm? The secret is the child has to feel safe. The child has to feel secure. So whatever we're going to do, that's our primary goal. One of the mistakes we make is when our kids are in this state together, you know, that we start to lecture, that we go, it's called metacognitive. We're going to explain, don't behave that way.
Yeah,
or
stop.
So when a child is in that red brain state, it's exactly like the case you and I were just talking about over dinner. They aren't processing what you're saying. And in fact, you trying to explain this or you trying to teach is a further stress. It's stressful for them, trying to absorb what you're doing. So what we say is that what we want to do is first turn off the alarm.
Right.
You will have the chance to explain to both of your kids, but let's say she's worried about the 14-year-old here.
Yeah.
You'll have that chance to go through it, to debrief, to figure out, you know, why you lost it, but not in the moment.
Yeah.
So we have to wait until we have that perfect time alone where we can start to figure out strategies so that the 14-year-old doesn't go red brain, and so that the two of them, you know, we see this, for example, it can be very tough on a car ride.
Yes. Nowhere to go, no way to separate in that situation. Yeah.
So we start to figure out what are the strategies so that we can prevent that kind of toxic bouncing off each other from happening. And there's lots of strategies.
I mean, all siblings fight. I mean,
all siblings fight.
It's, you know, typical or not. But I mean, the interesting thing I'm thinking as a parent in the situation, I guess I'm lucky to only have the one. But as a parent is thinking about, you know, what you said earlier is what got them both to that point.
Yes, that's right.
Right? It's not like...
Oh, Matt, you got to come work for us.
Well, it's not post hoc ergo propter hoc. You know, it's not just because it happened, this thing happened before, this is the outcome of it. They both came at this problem from different places.
That's great.
As a parent, like...
That's terrific. Really.
But as a parent, how do you start? Like, let's just say that this family here, you know, they've been experiencing this for a bit. They're coming to Self-Reg or the philosophies or the principles that you're introducing. This is new to them. Do you journal? How do you start getting your head around understanding your two different children in a way like that?
So I like the journaling idea. That's pretty good.
Okay.
The very first step is be kind to yourself.
Okay.
And the reason we say that is because when this happens, our own limbic system, our own limbic alarm, it just goes like that. It triggers right away. And we get angry. So let's say we get angry at our older kid. You should know better. You should. And so what we have to recognize is two things. First, you are going to get angry. And what do you do when that's happened? Well, you apologize later.
Yeah.
When it's come down, say, you know, I'm sorry, but I had a tough day. But the second thing you want to do is what you just said. And that is that as you're starting to figure this out, you realize, you know, there are lots and lots of times when my 14-year-old doesn't lose it when the little one does this. So what was different today, you know, and starting to figure it out and helping her figure it out. The really exciting part of all this is doing it for the younger one.
Yeah.
And the younger one can learn this too.
Right. You've talked a lot today. Well, we haven't talked a lot about, but you're a doctor and you've gone back to the brain, very complex organism. We're changing all the time. Sensory inputs are changing. How important do you find it is for parents who come to you or when you're workshopping for everyone to understand the brain better to do this?
We think it's huge.
Okay.
And the reason we say that is there has been a huge revolution in neuroscience over the last 20 years. Neuroscience and something called psychophysiology. And what this is all about is the self-control model that you and I have been talking about thinks that really you've got to dampen down these impulses. You've got to force them down. And what we've learned over the last 20 years is that when a kid or we go red brain, it shuts off those systems that would actually do that.
Yeah.
You started off, the very first thing you said today was that kids have to develop their executive functions, and teens especially, and it's hard. Unfortunately, when you go red brain, it turns off the executive functions.
Right.
Okay. So what we've learned from neuroscience isn't simply that this is happening, because that would be just a little bit of science.
Yeah.
We've also learned what are the signs of when this is happening. And so what are the signs in my child's voice, in my child's eyes? You can even, as you start to learn this, and we've learned this through some incredible studies on this kind of primitive brain system.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, and this is the reason why we do the neuroscience part, you start to see your child differently. And when you see your child differently, you see a different child.
Well, when you mean see them differently, what do you mean? I'm assuming, and maybe I'm wrong, that as a parent we're blinded to a lot of things when it comes to our children. God knows I am. But what happens when I see them differently? What am I seeing?
First of all, you're seeing a kid that's trying their best.
Right.
You're seeing a kid that is finding various things pretty tough. You're seeing a kid, and this is what we were talking about when you said you wanted to put GoPros on this.
Yeah.
You're seeing a kid who has tremendous potential, and you don't know what that potential is. You are continually being told that your child has limited potential. But what happens when we can release these limbic brakes is we suddenly see a new child, we suddenly see, I had no idea what my child's potential was, because this ancient part of the brain is holding them back. And if I can release that, then my child can begin to develop emotionally, socially, intellectually, in ways that previously I didn't think was possible. And that's what we're trying to do with all this.
Yeah.
So this is a very hopeful strategy. What we want parents to see is that if we can use this neuroscience to release these brakes, then my child's trajectory in life changes.
Right. Well, we're not all going to run out and get our neuroscience PhD, but we can go to the Merit Center's website, which you find in the resource section, as well as one of my favorite places on the internet. That is the Autism Ontario Knowledge Centre, where you'll learn a lot about this, specifically as it relates to children on the spectrum. Let's go back to your questions and get some more answers. My 12-year-old son understands coping strategies to deal with stress and can talk about them when he is calm, but is still not able to implement them when he is under stress. How do we practice with him in a way that will help him use them when he is stressed?
Okay, so I love that question.
Yeah.
So the way we explain this is we use what's called an inverted V curve.
Okay.
Okay. And really what she's saying is, so if you go to this, that one, and imagine it as a V.
Okay.
All right. Now, when he's in that nice blue state on the far left, he can talk about these coping strategies. He can explain it. He's really great. When he's gone on the right side into that red zone, then he can't do it. Can't apply it. Okay. So now, if we look at this as a V with a peak, so what we want our kid to learn is when he is starting to go up that peak.
Right.
He has to do the self-regulation before he hits the peak. Can he learn this? Can he learn the signs? That's why we have that fourth step in self-reg, that learning, stress awareness, learning when he is starting to go up, starting to head towards the red zone. He can't do it. He's not going to be able to do it once he's gone past the peak.
So I imagine that there's, every kid's different, but I imagine that there are some typical things to look for. Is it palm sweatiness, a feeling?
Yeah, that's good.
You know what I mean? Are there things that they should be looking out for to help the child?
Yeah, so what's happening is that as he starts to move up the peak, his heart starts to beat faster and his breathing starts to speed up. And so those are physiological. Now, what you're asking me are there signs of when he's moving up that I can read? Oh, that's what's happening with this heart.
Or even to help him read.
That's absolutely right.
Right.
Love it. Yes. Okay, so now with my kid, so I'm going to figure out, is it that a certain fixation starts to come in? Is it that he starts to talk a certain way? He starts to talk faster. He starts to talk nonstop. Is it that he stops talking entirely? There are signs, and each child is different. Now, the next step, so I'm going to figure those out. And those are, in fact, and there are some really kind of cool physiological signs that we can look at, or we can look at behaviors.
Right.
The next thing we're going to do is what you just said. Can I teach that to him? Yes. And that's where self-regulation becomes self-regulation.
Yeah.
Him learning to recognize that these signs are signs that I'm going up this peak.
Yeah.
These are my signs that I got to do it now. What do I do at this moment? Well, I'll give you an example. So with my son, so I got a 15-year-old too.
Yeah.
So with my son, what he does when he's starting to go up is he's learned, he's a hockey player.
Yeah.
So he goes out and he shoots pucks at the garage. Not so good for mom's self-reg, really good for his.
Yeah.
With my daughter, what she used to like to do was Lego. Okay. Now each kid has to learn what works for them.
Right.
For me, I actually, I'll go, as you said, I'll go out for a run. But for my wife, that's the worst thing.
Yeah.
So each one of us learns, but he has to learn what's his go-to.
Right.
When I'm going up, what's my go-to that's going to help me? And essentially what's happening here is he's running out of energy.
Yeah.
That's where we started. And the more he dips into his energy, the higher he gets towards his peak. So what he's got to do is he's got to refill the tank.
Yeah.
But not with short-term. Because the problem with short-term, like a candy bar, is it gives him that little burst, but then leaves him even more depleted.
Yeah.
So are there long-term things? Is it listening to music? Is it whatever?
Yeah. I'm not sure if we have time for the can of worms I'm about to open. But a lot of we had some at home ones here, but we've talked a lot about in public, at school.
Yeah.
School is a stressor for all of us. We
Yes.
all remember being in high school and,
Yes.
Typical or otherwise. How embedded is this idea of self-regulation, or even having people within the school system identify that these things are going on to be able to help students? And a follow-up to that is it really parental advocacy that needs to help in that school situation?
Okay, I love this as a final question.
Okay.
So an awful lot of our work at the Merit Center is, in fact, with school boards.
Right.
Schools and school boards across the country. And what we find is when we get a school to go self-reg,
Yes.
that it's unbelievable how everybody benefits. Not just the kid on the spectrum, but all of the kids, all of the teachers, and it radiates out into the community. So the second part of your question is, yes, you absolutely have to advocate for your child, and you need the school to understand that there is this model that's being rolled out and it has wonderful effects. But when you're advocating for every child in that school.
Right.
You're advocating for every teacher in that school. You're advocating not just for your child, but for all of the other kids too. They all need this.
Right. It is a great point. We hear that a lot. Generally, anything. We were on the desk talking about just things that can be done in schools for all children with disabilities, not ASD, but any disability. And the way the case study evidence shows just how much everyone benefits from it. It's not just the kids with,
that's absolutely right.
with disabilities. So we've talked about a lot of things today, and we kind of went a little bit off script, but I think it was a pretty good discussion. You can access these PowerPoint slides in the Resource Center, along with a lot of other information that relates to the topics that we discussed. Again, information on the Merit Center, which is an online educational tool, just like this webinar series is. Before we say goodbye here, I'd like to give you a chance. If our audience takes nothing away from today other than this last message that you want to give them, what would that moment of Zen be?
The biggest lesson that we've learned is that it is never too late to do this.
Okay.
So if you feel that, my child's a teenager and they're having problems with self-regulation, and I should have done this when they were 3 or 4 or 5, The answer is there is no point in the lifespan where this doesn't make a big difference in our quality of life.
Right.
So there's no kid who doesn't benefit from this. There's no time where we can't start to do this.
The ship has not sailed.
Exactly.
All right. And with that, that is all the time that we have today. If you found this presentation insightful, which I know I sure found the discussion insightful, it'll be available on demand tomorrow. And so you'll be able to share that with any of your friends, family, or loved ones at this same link, or just send them to the Autism Ontario website where they will find this and many other helpful and informational tools. I know there were questions that we did not get to, and I'm sure there's a number of them, but we will aspire to get back to you with answers to each one of your questions. But I think what you learned today here is that a lot of the questions have a very similar answer. So I implore you to check out, what's the name of your book again?
Self-Reg.
Self-Reg, the book. You can find that in the resource section. Go to the Merit Center website, and we look forward to seeing you guys next time at our next Autism Ontario event.